Namaste and welcome. In our program, Yoga for Unity and Wellbeing 100 Days towards the International Day of Yoga, we will be exploring and speaking about yoga and health this week. In our lecture series, we have with us Srimati Rajvi Mehta. She is a direct disciple of the great B.K.S. Iyengar. B.K.S. Iyengar needs no introduction because his name is the name connected to yoga the world over. Today, Srimati Rajvi Mehta is going to talk to us about her experiences with this great master, the way she became a disciple, and the life and teachings of great B.K.S. Iyengar. Let's welcome her and join her to listen to this most extraordinary story that, of course, has become the foundation of yoga in our current times.
So, good evening, and thank you for inviting me to talk about the tradition of Yogacharya B.K.S. Iyengar. Now, we do all know that yoga is as ancient as civilization, and it is really impossible for us to date when yoga came into existence. So, it is said that Lord Shiva taught it to goddess Parvati, and there is lot in mythology about yoga. But even if we look at the texts, we have the Bhagavad Gita, we have the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, and even that they date several centuries. So if we look at the text of, say, Patanjali Yoga Sutra, a text totally devoted to yoga, which primarily is a compilation of Yoga Sutras. It is not the first text on yoga, there have been many texts before. But over the millennia, over the centuries, over the decades, there have been so many commentaries on these Yoga Sutras. So if you look at the Yoga Sutras, it is just 196 sutras. And you can imagine right from the time of Vyasa to the 21st century, we have people talking about the Yoga Sutras. So one can imagine how terse, how deep these sutras are. And in the 20th century, we had Guruji B.K. Iyengar, who had his own unique interpretation of yoga, and which is now popularly called as Iyengar Yoga. So, if we look back in time, how did Iyengar Yoga come in? I mean, was it that Guruji B.K. Iyengar just decided one day to give his name and make it an adjective and call it Iyengar Yoga? Of course not. He was a purist, he was a traditionalist, and he never did any such thing. But however, as he understood yoga, he taught yoga, and his methodology of teaching has been so unique that people started calling it Iyengar Yoga. So, for example, when people did yoga, had studied yoga under him, and they interacted with somebody else, no, we don't do it this way, we do it this way. So, they just started saying yoga as studied or learned from B.K. Iyengar. And later, people would, instead of saying yoga in the tradition or as taught by B.K. Iyengar, they made it into an adjective, called it Iyengar Yoga. And then some of them today even say, I do Iyengar, which is quite amusing because obviously you cannot do Iyengar. But that is how his methodology has gained so much popularity. And to understand what is this tradition of Yogacharya B.K. Iyengar, we need to understand his own life and his work during his lifetime, because his life, his work is highly intertwined with his teachings. So the tradition has evolved. It was not something that is established or set up. So let's go back in time, and we go back to 1918 during the world influenza pandemic. And today, I'm sure all of us understand what a pandemic means. Maybe a few years back, we sort of knew what a pandemic means. Today, we have experienced it. And Guruji B.K. Iyengar's mother was suffering from influenza at the time of that pandemic when she was pregnant with him, and thus he was born as a very sick child. And in those days, there were many children. Many children didn't make it up to the age of 5. And he was one of those who suffered from ill health and was not expected to live long. And that is when, he sort of managed. And it was just chance that his elder sister was married to a yoga vidwan, Yogacharya T. Krishnamacharya. And in those days, Yogacharya Krishnamacharya, a vidwan, would travel across the country, delivering his lectures, that one day he asked his brother-in-law that why doesn't he come and stay with his sister. And that's how Sundar Raja, as he was called then, went to live with him in Mysore, or rather went to live with his sister. And it is during this time that he was introduced to yoga, because Guruji Krishnamacharya used to teach yoga and he would go to his yogashala after he stayed there. And that's when Guruji T. Krishnamacharya realized that this boy is so sick. He was about 14 then, and said, I'll teach you a few asanas so you can gain some health. And it was Guruji who was fascinated by the word health. I mean, for somebody who is always a backbencher in school, missing school, always sick. So if somebody gives you something which you are lacking, you always get excited by it, you look forward to it. It's like what money would mean to a poor person. So it was in the same situation that Guruji B.K. Sangar got very, very enamored by the hope of achieving health. And he stayed with his guru for 2 years, who taught him a few asanas and sort of trained him. And then, after 2 years, deputed him to go to Pune. So, what would a 16-year-old really understand about the philosophy of yoga, the depth of yoga, the transformative powers of yoga? But, well, with whatever little knowledge he had, he went to Pune, and that's where he was introduced to teaching a group of youngsters in the Deccan Gymkhana Club. Now, even today, some of the clubs are, people who visit these clubs are those that belong to an elite class and so on. So it was then. So now here is a boy who is looking like a traditional Brahmin going to an elite club in the 1930s in Pune and trying to teach young men yoga. And mind you, yoga was not something looked upon then. It was meant for, the aesthetics, those who had left society. It was not meant for the common man. And he took up this challenge to teach. And that's where he learned the power of communication, because he didn't speak. He spoke Kannada, he spoke Tamil, and he had failed in English, but he spoke a few words of English. And then he comes to Pune, where the local language is Marathi, and he struggles and manages. Now he has no choice, so it was as if yoga was that was the only option he had to manage a living, and that's how he got into yoga and he started teaching yoga. Since there were not many takers, he spent hours and hours practicing. And then he soon realized that this subject had a lot of depth than what he had understood. So he started noticing the transformations in his body, the transformations in his ability to do the different asanas. And over the years, he started understanding the connection between the body and the mind, the body and the emotions, the body and the intelligence, the body and the consciousness, the body and the conscience. So, over the decades, his practice gave him a practical understanding of yoga, and that became his methodology of teaching. Now, in the 1940s, the common man, as I said, never did much of yoga. Yoga was for those who chose the spiritual path, the ascetics, or those who wanted to run away from family life, or rather, I wouldn't say run away, but did not want to get into a family life. And it was Guruji who decided that no, I would like to see how yoga can help the common man, and that's how he started teaching the common people. And that it started in Pune, and then he was called by a Jain monk to teach in Mumbai, and he started coming to Mumbai from the 1950s onwards till about 1990s. And all of us here in Mumbai are a product of that generation where we literally grew up, because we were so very fortunate that he came weekend after weekend to Mumbai to teach. And we incidentally, unaware of what yoga is, actually started attending his classes. So that was, I think, one of the biggest contributions, that bringing yoga to the common man with the notion that even if they didn't proceed on the high spiritual path, at least their life would become better. So he would say that practice yoga. If you're a teacher, you'll become a better teacher. If you're a doctor, you'll become a better doctor. If you're a homemaker, you'll become a better homemaker. So whatever you do, you'll be better than what you are, and at least make a start. It was not easy to get students, because who would want to pay to learn yoga in the 40s and 50s? Secondly, we need not forget that this was just the post independent time. And at that point of time, most of us, or I would say my previous generations, were slightly brainwashed about or against Indian culture and traditions. And very often, the common person looked down on these kind of things. And so be it. However, there were people who were suffering, who had not managed to attain solace with their health problems with whatever conventional modes of treatment, would approach him, and he took up each of these cases as a challenge and worked on them, understood, because he had by then gained a lot of understanding of the human body. And as he later told us, you people, the medical doctors study anatomy on a dead body. I have studied it on a living body. And that is how he could modify the various asanas that he had studied and get them to do it. And gradually, people started seeing benefit in what they do. And that's how he started getting more and more students with therapeutic problems. So I would think that he was the first, one of the earliest ones, I would say, I wouldn't want to make, that who actually brought yoga to the common man in the 20th century. Apart from that, he would teach people one is to one, as was tradition. However, as more students started coming in, it was practically impossible to teach one is to one, wherein he hardly communicated. He would get the person to do the asana. Later, he developed the skills of communication, so it would be a group of 10, 15, 30, and gradually those numbers started soaring to the time when he took a class of nearly 1,500 people in China, but at an age of 92. But what he always said is that you should teach the people whom you can see. So by that time, he had attained that ability to see each and every student. So there was, in the tradition of BKS Iyengar, or as Iyengar Yoga we call it, we don't have this real concept of an instructor where you give instructions, which is a one is to which is the individual giving instructions while the others follow. But here it is a constant dialogue where the teachers observes the students, and then the next set of instructions come in depending on what they observe. So even if there would be a class of say 100 people, 200 people, his eyes would catch each and everybody. So if there is somebody you wouldn't obviously know the names of all those people, it would be, hey, red t-shirt, what are you doing? So that is how, that was one of the abilities, that even if you taught group classes, you need to see each and every one. And that's the way he started organizing the classes, structuring the classes in such a way that at one glance you can see everybody. So if somebody has gone out of tune, it's possible for you to detect it and rectify that error. And at that point of time, people did question, yoga is to be taught one is to one. This is something which was, not really acceptable. But then, well, if people wanted to do it, they started doing it. So this is how he brought yoga to the common people. He started taking public classes for general public, for women. And as I said, that they were one of the earliest ones where yoga was taught as a healing science. Now, as people came in, people started benefiting. And at that point of time, there was no objective research, but there was umpteen amount of subjective research that he did on himself to give relief to the patient. And mind you, whether one had a problem in the skeletal-muscular system, or a problem in the liver or kidney or colon or lungs or the heart, finally they are all located within this body, within the skeletal-muscular system. So while people presumed that asanas are to be done with the physical body or the skeletal-muscular body, he had understood the connection between the asanas and the effect it had on the various physiological systems of the body, from be it respiratory, be it digestive, excretory, reproductive, neuroendocrine, endocrine, neurology. And therefore, he started adjusting the asanas in such a way that people could benefit. Now, all this was done through the postures and how those postures were performed. Now, we do know that when we talk of asanas as postures, it's a very loose translation of the word asana. Possibly the English language does not even have an appropriate term to define or to translate the word asana, but loosely stating it's a posture, and Guruji would say it is posing and reposing the body uh, so that it gets into a state of perfection. So through the asanas, when people started gaining benefit and from the health reasons, the it started getting known as yoga for health problems. So people would say, "Oh, you go to Iyengar yoga if you have any therapeutic issue." And he was so very observant, like he never really looked at the reports of individuals or the medical reports, but just looking at the person, the person's posture just while standing or while walking, the texture of their skin, the expressions on their face, he could identify. And sometimes he would just identify from, their clothes or their footwear. For example, if there was somebody who walked in once to the library where he would always be sitting meeting people and came and said, I have a back problem. And he said, okay, I can see it. I've seen it upstairs. And this person was wondering, how could I have seen him upstairs? We haven't met him. And why is he saying that he knows what my problem is? Well, the patient had actually had already gone down to the library while he had just entered. So their shoes were outside, the chappals were outside. And with his extreme scientific observational skills, he had noticed that the inner edge of the heel was totally, was very, very small, while the outer edge of the heel of the footwear was thicker. That means that individual was pressing the inner edge of the heel much more. So if the person is spreading the inner edge of the heel much more, then correspondingly there is a different behavior in the knee and the back of the person. And through that analysis, in that split second, he could identify the problem. So this is how, when we practice asanas, we are taught how one has to do each of these asanas precisely, because the body, the bones, the muscles, the ligaments which keep the bones in place, the ligaments, the tendons which keep the muscles and the bones in place, play such an important role. So, if the skeletal-muscular body, which we often call as the pillars and beams of a structure, if they are not proper, how do we expect the contents to be healthy? So it is very important to have these pillars and beams in perfect alignment, in perfect situation, so that the organic body, the organs can remain healthy. And this is how he started evolving his own practice and also transmitting the same to his students. And in the process, people found, yes, they remained healthy. And I remember even in his articles written in the 1930s, he was insisting that yoga should be taught to school children. In fact, in 30s and 40s, there were some meetings where he said, we should think of medicine, or we should think of keeping healthy people healthy, than trying to cure unhealthy people. And that is the time he used to start, he taught in schools. However, that point of time, it was not really accepted as it is today. And thus, yoga started going, into entire families. It was in 1950s, during, when the Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru invited the violinist Yehudi Menuhin to India. He was invited to give a couple of concerts so that he could generate some kind of funds for the flood hit victims in India. And Yehudi Menuhin had always been doing charity shows across the world to help suffering mankind. And he has this ability or this, desire to know about the country he visited a little before. So in one of his memoirs, he had read that India had something like yoga. And therefore, he had told Pandit Nehru that, I want to know more about yoga. And Pandit Nehru had obviously kept a couple of individuals, yoga gurus, ready to meet him. Now, one of Guruji's students in Mumbai, a Parsi lady who was into Western classical music, had also requested Guruji to come to Mumbai to meet Menuhin. And the story goes that, Menuhin was staying in the governor's house and he had invited Guruji, but by the time Guruji reached there he said, oh, I've met a lot of people and I'm very tired. I don't want to meet you. And Guruji, the yogi that he was, but at the same time, a very practical man, and who was never overwhelmed by anybody, said, "You've called me all the way from Pune. I need to, meet you and find out what it is." He's saying, "Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes." And then he expressed to him that he was so very fatigued with his concerts. So Guruji made him do Shanmukhi Mudra and made him rest. And then for 45 minutes of deep relaxation that he got, and that turned out into nearly 40 to 45 years of friendship. So this is how, when Menuhin realized the depth of this subject, that in 45 minutes, if he could get this kind of relaxation, he just wanted to know more. And he invited Guruji to join him in UK and Switzerland. Guruji refused. He's had a family in Pune and he says, I cannot move abroad. However, he insisted and he said, okay, he would go to teach for a month. And that's how yoga was introduced to the elite, because Yehudi Menuhin was one of the highly acclaimed violinist of his time who moved around with aristocrats, including the Queen Mother of Belgium and famous pianist. So he introduced Guruji to many of these elite people who started learning yoga all over Europe. And one fine day, when he returned to India, somebody made a note that here comes a man who teaches the stars. And he felt very hurt by it. He says, no, yoga is for everybody. I mean, I don't like this. So next time when he was invited to UK, he told Menuhin that, yes, I will teach you and your esteemed colleagues, but on a condition that I also want to teach the common people of London. And that's how the first public yoga class was conducted by the Asian Music Circle under Yehudi Menuhin with 6 students, of which one was the manager of that Asian Music Circle, one was a student who was Guruji student in Mumbai and a Britisher who lived in London, and there were 4 new students who were curious about yoga or had read something about it. And it was these 6 students that started off a public class, which over the decades led to students across the world. Uh, from these 6 students, then they started teaching, saying, okay, you've learned something till I come back next year, you can teach your friends and families. And from there, it so happened that there was the Inner London Education Authority. Now, this ILEA would teach adult education and they wanted to introduce the subject of yoga. So they found that this method which BK Sanger was teaching was bereft of any kind of religion, or so they said, yes, why don't you teach? But they put conditions in front of him. One of the condition was you cannot talk about philosophy. You cannot use Sanskrit terms. And imagine for a yogi not to use philosophy, not to use Sanskrit, it's like you are cut off. How do you teach? So he said, well, at least they are getting introduced to the subject of yoga. At least more people will take to this subject of yoga. And that's when he said that, okay, I will take up this challenge. Saying, what's in the name? Even if they don't know the name just now, later they will learn it. But let them introduce. So it's like, when you're introducing a subject to people, children in kindergarten or primary school, they don't know the depth of the subject, but you introduce them in a playful manner and then they grow and evolve. So some may not go maybe to very high levels of learning, but some may go to higher levels of learning. And that's how we started. Then the question came in, it was in the late 60s, that there are a lot of people who are teaching yoga. We need some kind of a certification from you that yes, these people are qualified. And that's where a certification system was set up by him way back in the 1960s. And there were different levels of certification, which made sure that the people who taught were well experienced and knowledgeable, so that the students who came to them were safe. It was very important that we, as yoga teachers, were working on the bodies and minds of individuals. And it is a big responsibility. So, if a medical student takes a Hippocratic oath of do no harm, same applies to the yoga teacher, because the student is submissive. They hand over their bodies and minds to us. So he started a certification system, identifying an assessment system, and made sure that the students who went to these certified teachers were in safe hands, would as the teachers would know how to handle them. And the teachers were also given a specific syllabus that they do not go beyond, so that the student doesn't get harmed. At the same time, he didn't make it very rigid. So, as he would say, it is within the Lakshman Rekha. You each have your own personality, your own identity, so you teach according to that. We are not robots, so we give the same instructions, but don't go beyond the Lakshman Rekha. And that's how certification and assessment went. Even at that point of time, he knew that continuous learning is absolutely essential. Studies never end. As his daughter Gita ji had once said, she would actually often say, knowledge has a beginning, but there is no end. And therefore, continuing education is an absolute hallmark of this tradition, of I would say, which is for any subject. But here it is absolutely essential. And every a teacher of Iyengar Yoga is always a student of Iyengar Yoga. Like Guruji, even at the age of 90 and 92, would say, I'm learning something new and I want to share it with you people. So this is how, the assessment system, the certification system, the continuous learning system has been imbibed in this tradition from the 1960s onwards. And then initially, of course, all the teachers who were trained under him. But and then it happened that from UK they possibly migrated to South Africa, or they migrated to US or Canada, and that's how, more and more teachers started coming up. So this is how it actually spread, I would say, organically. However, over a period of time, the numbers became so large that there needed to be a formalized, structured training program. And in this kind, in the structured training program, it was meant that it had to be very rigid. So all those who were interested needed to be a student for at least 4 to 5 years before they would enter such a program. And even after entering the program, it would take them 3 to 4 years to get an introductory certificate to teach. Now, this is something which is, I think, very, very important, because I think yoga is the only subject today where there are teacher training courses before studentship. So I'm sure, like many other schools of yoga, we do get calls from people saying, "Do you offer teacher training?" We said, "Well, we don't offer teacher training. And what are the criteria? You need to be a student." "Oh, I'm not a student of yoga, but I want to become a teacher." Can we imagine somebody wanting to teach math, science, medicine without being a student of that subject? So it is something, where it has become so shallow in some cases that you do a weekend course, you do a month's course, and you become teachers. Well, obviously they can be teachers, but then the quality of the teaching would be highly compromised. So your teacher training is very, very rigid, very assessed, because as I said earlier, we have to be very responsible for the body and mind of the students. Then he came in with the book, The Light on Yoga, which the BBC had called the Bible of Yoga, and which has sort of become, even after 50 years, it has become one of the standard texts on yoga. A very brief but very strong, concise introduction to the philosophy of yoga, and a detailed series of asanas that can be done, and the detailed methodology for doing it. And the purpose of his book was, he said, a good book is better than a bad teacher, so that at least for people who didn't have access to teachers, they could study from the book. Of course, for anybody who is working in the field of yoga, who has some interest in the subject of yoga, would have heard of Light on Yoga. Now, in Light on Yoga, he has given detailed techniques of adjustments and then the effects of the asanas. And mind you that this book, and with his photographs of him doing the asanas, so there are about 600 photographs for about 200 asanas that have been described, asanas and pranayam. And if we look back, actually this book became a trendsetter, because after that came in many books on yoga which formed the same format. And in fact, in UK, there has been a doctoral thesis which has done on books before Light on Yoga and after Light on Yoga, because it gave people a perspective of how to write a book on yoga, wherein, without any, and mind you, it's been written in the 1960s, wherein there were, we didn't have any kind of photo editing software or much of videos to present how we do it in the media today. So now coming back to, and then of course he wrote his book Light on Pranayama, and then Light on Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and many more books. All these books were based on his experience. So they became a hallmark. He did not refer to any book and write from that. He wrote only from his experience. So if you see in his own journey in yoga, it started with health, it started with practicing of asanas. The practice of asanas, when he started getting some effects, he would transmit it to his students. And then he started referring to the texts of yoga, and he started corroborating his experience with what the texts say. For example, if the text said Sthiram Sukham Asanam, then he wanted to experience that what am I not doing if I'm not getting Sthiram Sukham Asanam? What should I do if to get Sthira Sukham Asanam? So he started looking for his experience in the text. Now, mind you, this is very rare where a student studies practical first and then goes to theory. So for most subjects, if you're studying chemistry, you study the theory first, then you go to practical studies. So also for any other subject where you have a theory class and a practical class. However, here it is we start with practical first. So we start with the practice of few asanas, maybe at the skeletal-muscular level, and then as you progress, you start seeing the connections between the body mind. You see these connections between the different asanas, how one asana teaches the other, and then you start seeing the connections between the practice and the Yoga Sutras. So it is one of the rare subjects where you start studying practical, then you go to theory. And that is the reason possibly it's become so very popular that people started experiencing first and then went to philosophy, where both these got very closely integrated. And as I said some time back, he was given the challenge of not using Sanskrit words, of not talking of philosophy when he started teaching yoga in the UK. Mind you, it was just a few decades later that all over the world people started pronouncing the names of all the asanas in Sanskrit. It was they themselves did it. He did not insist on it, but they soon realized that the name conveyed something and started studying the Yoga Sutras. And mind you, it was not restricted to just the European countries. Even in Middle East, we hear that yoga, people talking about yoga as religion, and then a certain religions which don't accept it. Well, there is a minority which may not accept it, but overall people accept. Who doesn't want a better life? And therefore it is well accepted. And I can tell you that even in places where I have taught people myself in Dubai, where they are from the Saudi community, but these women recite the Yoga Sutras, they want to know more about the Yoga Sutras. So without any kind of compulsion or force or an enforced curriculum, he generated the interest, and that is how it's been organically spreading across the world. Now, the question that comes in is that yes, this is all of Guruji's methodologies which has spread, but what do you people do in your practices? What exactly, when you say, you're practicing Iyengar yoga? Well, if you ask me, I wouldn't know what the others do because that's all I have studied. And I presume each have their own tradition and interpretations and with which they do. However, when we interact with people, we realize that they do things differently, and that's where we started trying to understand what exactly is Iyengar yoga. And that's where we got to know that one of the aspects is the amount of emphasis that we lay on asanas. After all, the only instrument that we humans are born with is the body. And what can we do with the body? You can do the asanas, you do the pranayams, you do dharana, you do dhyana. All these are done by the body. So even if you're sitting for pranayama, you're sitting in an asana. Even if you're sitting for dhyana or you get into a state of dhyana, you are sitting in an asana. So Guruji gave a lot of emphasis for doing the asanas correctly. So there is a lot of precision and detailed techniques in the doing of the asanas. And some may say, why so much emphasis? You people are giving too much emphasis to the body. I mean, body is just a cloth. I mean, finally, it is you're going to discard it. Well, it's not done for the body. It is done. Whatever else we do, it's done through the body, and therefore it is essential to keep this body healthy. I mean, let's face it. How many of us who may claim to be highly spiritually inclined do not get affected when one is sick? How many Ramakrishna Paramhans and do we have, or Raman Maharshis do we have? Because if there were many, we wouldn't remember these few names. So most of us, and I would say when the body suffers, do get affected. So why not keep the body or work on it so that we can continue and pursue other practices of evolution within this framework? And that is why we started giving a lot of emphasis on precisely doing the asanas, because if done casually, the effects would be casual. If done precisely, the effects would be precise. Now, even if I'm just sitting, for example, if I raise my hands and I raise my hands like this, what is the effect? And I raise my hands and extend my arms, the whole voice, everything changes. So the body reflects our state of mind, reflects our state of emotions. And that's why there's a lot of detailed technique for getting precise movements and precise actions. Now, when it comes to precise movements and precise actions, now all human bodies are not same. In fact, even my own human body would be differing at different times of the day, at different times of health status, at different age. So naturally, the practices are, I wouldn't say modified, but tailored so that anyone can handle it. For example, if you're going to teach, say, a 10-year-old and you're going to teach a 60-year-old, you can't teach them in the same way. A 10-year-old is full of energy. We need to utilize their energy or channelize their energy. But if you look at a 60-year-old, they are not overflowing with energy. They want to preserve their energy. So even if they're both doing the same asana, the way they do it is different. Uh, for example, if a 60-year is doing it, the 60-year-old has a lot of maturity and experience and therefore would be taught differently. For a 10-year-old or a teenager, they are prepared to face the world. So you can't ask them to close their eyes and cut them off from the world. They are expected to live in this world. They need to develop the courage, they need to develop the confidence, they need to develop attributes so they can stand up to the ups and downs in life. So we can't cut them off from the reality of the world. But on the other hand, you have somebody older, you will say, okay, don't get disturbed by the environment in the world. You can, survive. So that's what happens in this pandemic. There would be practitioners, I'm sure, from all traditions or all the yoga practitioners who possibly found this time for their own personal growth, whilst there were people who found a sense of loneliness in this time of pandemic and the lockdowns. But possibly the yoga practitioners did not find loneliness, but they appreciate that aloneness where they could be with themselves. So, in this methodology of teaching, Guruji lays a lot of emphasis on precision, alignment, a detailed technique, the way we sequence our practices. I mean, I decided to do Shirshasana. I can't just go up into Shirshasana. I need to prepare myself. I need to prepare my body and my mind to do it. And later, as one starts practicing, you will realize that I may do the same Trikonasana which I had done 30 years ago, where there it has been loosely done by instructions of a teacher. But as one evolves, one starts seeing the connections between the body mind, as I said earlier, the body emotions, the body intelligence, the body consciousness. So there is an intrinsic guide, and we develop those intuitive abilities while doing it. So there is a continuous flow of awareness in the body. And that can be done in the simplest asanas. And well, if you are an evolved practitioner, you can make it happen even the more complex asanas. So this is what the practice involves. Now, coming back to the tradition, I would like to just give an example of the Yoga Sutra, Sthira Sukham Asanam. I mean, there are people who question, you people lay so much emphasis on asanas. After all, the Yoga Sutras have just 3 sutras on asana. Sthirasukamasanam, Prayatna Saithilya Ananta Samapatti and Tvata Dvandha Anabhigataha. Yes, there are only 3 sutras, but these 3 sutras tell us what should be the attribute of asana. Now, if we look at sthira, stability, sukha, a sense of pleasure, joy, composure, and asana is a posture, for example. One can interpret it as doing something in which you are happy and stable. So, well, I'm happy to be dull, lethargic, and I'm stable, I'm not moving. That, or you can say, being happy and stable in any condition. So, either doing something in which you are comfortable and you're happy, so we are limiting our zone, but being comfortable and happy and stable irrespective of the surrounding. And that's what I understand Guruji has seen it, and therefore that attribute is trained by trying to do various asanas and attain that stability and composure so that whenever there are any ups and downs in lives, you are able to handle it. So that's where it again comes back. Now, prayatna saithilya ananta samapatti. So, effort becoming effortless such that you have the sense of vastness, but along with it, a sense of being contented. Now, this is again, uh, if we talk about, sthira sukham asanam, effort becoming effortless. Isn't that karmasu kaushalam, skillfulness in action of the Bhagavad Gita? And when there is skillfulness in action, then comes samatvam, equanimity. So these attributes, if they come to the common man, imagine what state the world would be in. So even if each of us gets some parts of these attributes. So this is how we are trained in the practice of asanas, and it is through these practice of asanas where there's a certain amount of stability we get to the practice of pranayam. And in cases of asanas, if you do go wrong, well, you'll have a body ache, a pain, something's gone wrong. In the case of pranayam, if something goes wrong, the results are not evident. They come in much later. So, therefore, it is important that we establish the person in the practice of asanas to a certain level of stability and then move to pranayama, and then you get into the other states. So, what Iyengar yoga is that through the medium of asanas, you establish yourself in yama and niyama, which means that because of the practice of asanas, which initially starts with external discipline, yes, I have to go to class, I need to be regular in class, etc. But once that discipline becomes you, you are not just disciplining yourself, then yama and niyama become integral to you because your conscience will not permit you to be a yamic or a niyamic. So these attributes become yours, and it is through these asanas that you start getting into a state of pranayam. Has anybody said that pranayam should only be done in a sitting position? You may get pranayama to be done or get into a state of dhyana also in any position. After all, if we look at the statues at Shravan Belgola, it's a meditating statue, but he's standing. So we have also read about stories where the sages have meditated in different positions. So we need these asanas are used as tools, as means to experience the other seven aspects of Ashtanga Yoga. And therefore, now what is it for people who are, I would say, not physically fit? Obviously, if you expect them to do asanas, they are not physically fit, they cannot do it. Or they would do it in a compromised manner. And at the same time, I said you should be accurate, you should be precise. And that is why Guruji has divided props. So, right from the rubber mat, which has now become the yoga mat, to use of blankets and bolsters, belts, chairs, the beds, any of these are utilized as props, so at least you get some effect of the asana even if you don't get the final asana. So these props have become so popular across the world, and I'm told it's a few $1 billion industry. But well, it doesn't matter. When somebody asked Guruji, why haven't you patented the props, he said, did the rishi munis patent the asanas? Have they patented yoga? How can you patent props? It's for people to do it and gain experience from it. So this is how, today people just associate and tend to say, oh, Iyengar yoga, if you use props, it's Iyengar yoga. Not at all. If you look at the book Light on Yoga, there is not a single prop used except one prop where he's demonstrating, I think, a Sarvangasana. So basically, it is not essentially use of props, but these props help us to stay in asanas for prolonged duration. And therefore, we get a different experiential status as compared to doing. Say, for example, if you're doing Urdhva Dhanurasana or back arch, then how long can an individual stay? But if you're doing it on a chair, you can stay for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And naturally, the state of the mind changes in that long period of time. The state of the breath changes. So naturally, you start getting experiences which you cannot get in a short stay of the asanas. So this is how Guruji has evolved practice, and it has become universal. So whether one is practicing, say, in Europe or Middle East or Southeast Asia or China or US, at the base level, people are doing it in a fairly standardized manner. And then as one goes deeper and deeper, so one may have done Trikonasana 40 years ago and you do the same Trikonasana today. But the way one does it is totally different. The what one experiences, are very, very difficult to express, but one starts experiencing the Yoga Sutras through the asanas. So it brings the Yoga Sutras to life. And I would say today that, that whatever Guruji has taught, and especially in this current time, I realize that it makes life livable and lively for people. And as I just written a book wherein I've just compiled some stories of individuals who have had, for us common people, very stressful lives. Imagine, having 5 relapses of cancer in a span of 20 years. What would be the state of the mind of that individual? And this person, who is a practitioner of yoga, goes ahead and says, well, cancer is a part of life, don't make it bigger than life. Or an individual who's lost both his legs to a landmine, or people who have lost their vision, their hearing, their speech, but are so very happy. So I think the message is that the tradition of Guruji B.K. Iyengar is meant for one and all. It can make you better as a professional in whatever you do. It can make you better as a human being in what you do. it makes you more compassionate and maybe helpful to people around you. You integrate the practices of Ashtanga yoga, the yama, niyama, pranayam, pratyahar, dharana, dhyana, depending on the level of your practice. So if you practice at a basic level, you get basic effects. If you practice at a deeper level with a lot of involvement, you get different effects. And I think it's the big thing is that it makes life lively for those people who live. And like Guruji Iyengar had said, and he practiced till his very end, I think the desire of most of his students would be to continue with their practices, not just for keeping oneself healthy. I mean, after all, we are taken the human form. Health is not essentially something we can take for granted. It's health, diseases, aging, all those problems are going to be there. But at least how we can endure them and pursue on our yogic path. So I've tried in very brief to give sort of an idea of what Guruji B.K. Sangar's teachings are and how we try to implement that in our practices and our teachings across the world. So wish you all a happy International Day of Yoga. I think for us, this International Day of Yoga is to take it as an opportunity for all those who have not had an opportunity to walk this path, to at least make an attempt and see what it gives you. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope I've able to have shed some light to you all. Thank you.